I nearly forgot to discuss how the pivot table can be used in functions. This is always a fairly confusing issue and one that most people will get frustrated with because of the strangeness of the GETPIVOTDATA function. Pivot tables under default functionality work a little strangely when referencing them by formula. If I try to enter a formula and point to one of the cells in my pivot table, instead of getting a typical reference, my cell is populated with a long and convoluted formula. So what exactly is going on? This formula is actually an incredibly powerful and useful feature of pivot tables. Instead of simply referencing cell F9, the reference links to a very specific calculation within the pivot table itself. We can see that I've linked to the widget 20 quantity cell, which has a value of 49. Now, what happens if I select description and uncheck widget 5? Well, widget 5 has been removed from my pivot table and the pivot table shrinks by one column. With a normal reference to cell F9, I would now be looking at widget 23, which has a quantity of 17, yet my cell still shows 49. Why? Well, instead of pointing to a specific cell, the GETPIVOTDATA function points to the pivot table itself and then defines a query which returns a specific result. In this case, it's asking the pivot table for the quantity field for widget 20 specifically. We can learn more about this function by reading each of the components and looking at what they are doing. The first item reads measures.sumOfQuantity2. This is identifying which numerical value field to pull. You may ask, why does it read SumOfQuantity2 when our field says SumOfQuantity? And this issue is going to boil down to our Excel data model definition. We have two quantity fields, which means we have two SumOfQuantity possibilities. Because we're using the second field we defined from the invoicing support, the pivot table formula recognizes it as SumOfQuantity2. This value provides a name indication as to what value should be pulled from the pivot table. We could replace the text with another reference, such as if I set it to N2, and then I can select measures.sumOfQuantity from that cell, which I've already defined as an option, and then recalculate. But there's a minor catch here. Doing this, you see that I have a #ref error. While I don't understand the exact reasons, I do suspect that it is due to the way that GETPIVOTDATA was written and to expect a string rather than a reference. But this problem can be easily fixed by going to my formula and concatenating an empty string to the end, which gets my function to return 49 again. Now we have a formula that connects to our pivot table, and I can select different options from this dropdown to see different values. The next input is the only default reference provided by the function when automatically created, and it refers to cell C6. Looking at my pivot table, you can see that cell C6 is empty. However, this is simply a pointer to indicate which pivot table to use. C6 happens to be the starting point for my current pivot table. I can insert any type of logical construct I desire here to select different pivot tables based upon different criteria. I could use an if statement, for example, to select different pivot tables based upon a user selection. The third input and corresponding fourth input is where our function starts to get really convoluted and challenging to understand. The third input relates directly to the fourth input, and all further inputs to this function must come in pairs of 2. Looking at my tooltip support, you can see the field 1, item 1, field 2, item 2 construction types in the tooltip. For our field 1, we're looking at invoice support.description. You might notice that this is the general field that contains our widget names, and it also contains the table name. For our item 1, we're looking at a long text string that ultimately ends up with widget 20. This is the component that describes the filter that we want to apply to our data. As we can have many different row or column entries, we can have as many GETPIVOTDATA filter items as we need with this type of a setup. The structure of the text may look odd to a typical Excel user, however creating a few GETPIVOTDATA functions will quickly teach you the pattern. For this one, I could just as easily have a dropdown in N3, which I do, that offers each of our different widget options. Then I can modify the formula by eliminating widget 20, concatenating it with the reference, and of course closing the brackets. Then I can select widget 14 and see my results. Now, my GETPIVOTDATA function has some fairly strict limitations. The data in question must actually be visible in my pivot table. Here I have widget 14 selected. Now what happens if I eliminate it in my description filter? Well, I get a #reference error because I've filtered that data away. Depending on your situation, this can be either very frustrating or very useful. I can clear the description filter and instead select another client code where widget 14 doesn't exist. Now the error could have some value by telling me that widget 14 has no entries for this situation, but the error does not clarify between these two different cases. This function can be great for creating specialized reports based upon multiple pivot tables, or even for integrating pivot table data into other functions without relying on a static pivot table format. Of course, the GetPivotData function isn't for everyone or even for all situations, so there are some ways around it. First, I can always simply write equals E9 to get my widget 23 sum of quantity. But now if my fields move around, like if I add another filter and take out widget 15, my reference keeps pointing to cell E9, which is now widget 25 instead of widget 23. Alternatively, I can completely disable the Excel functionality that automatically creates the GetPivotData link. To do this, I can go to File, go to Options, and then under the formula options, I can uncheck the use GetPivotData functions for pivot table references. As soon as I press OK, creating any formulaic link to the pivot table and using my mouse will create a reference instead of a GetPivotData link. My GetPivotData function still exists, and it still works. The only difference now is that if I start typing a formula and select a cell in the pivot table, I get a common reference. In using these pivot tables, it can be important to understand how to best pull data from the table for use elsewhere. Standard references are useful in some cases, while the GetPivotData reference is useful in others. The situation will always drive which will best suit your needs. And generally, the challenge inherent with using the GetPivotData function will drive many people away, particularly if the file is meant to be used and shared. Either way, you should now have enough information and knowledge to play around with the function and use it, or not use it as you desire.